안녕하세요. 반갑습니다.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sun-Jin from EU-Korea Climate Action. First and foremost, I would like to thank you very much for participating in this Korea-EU webinar on strategies and policies to achieve 2050 net zero emissions, organized by the Korea-EU Climate Action and also Energy Transition Forum. Before we begin, I would like to make a few housekeeping announcements. First of all, the presentation materials, if you click the download icon on the top side of the webinar screen, then you can get the downloads of the presentation materials. And also, if you do have any questions, please enter your questions in the Q&A window. And after the event, please fill out the survey form. So you can click the survey icon, and you only need to spend 30 seconds to complete the survey. And also, the videos of this event will be uploaded onto the websites of Korea-EU Climate Action and Energy Transition Forum. So it's on your demand and it's available. So if you want to review the video later, then please visit our websites. Now we would like to begin the main part of the event. In the year 2015, the Paris Agreement was signed, where countries around the world decided to participate in the efforts for GHG reduction, and the parties to the UN Climate Change Convention set the targets for GHG reduction and also submit the implementation plans to the United Nations. Especially this year, they have to come up with the long-term low-emission development strategies, or LEDS, that reflect the GHG reduction targets by 2050. Korea decided to reduce the greenhouse gas emission by 37% by 2030 against the PAU. And also, only this year, they have come up with the 5 different types of scenarios where the GHG reduction target is set at maximum 75% to the minimum 40%. However, they have not produced the carbon neutral scenario for 2050 yet. And therefore, the EU-Korea Climate Action and Energy Transition Forum have pursued the research projects and also expert workshops since May in order to find out solutions for carbon neutrality for Korea, and also in order to study what kind of strategies and policies are needed to achieve this vision. And this webinar is also conducted as part of this 2050 net zero emission strategy and development policy development project. And so I believe that today's webinar will give us a very good opportunity to talk about the energy transition in industry sectors and also green financing, which will be very critical to achieving the carbon neutrality vision. And also today we would like to hear from the European Union that have already set the carbon neutrality target for 2050 already back in 2018. So I believe that their experiences will give us a lot of learning points. As for the schedule for today's event, we'll first hear from the opening remark and also some major presentations and discussions. So during the first session, the Korean speakers will talk about the project that I introduced just before, the 2050 net zero emission strategy and policy development project. And then in session 2, the European experts will talk about the industry energy transition strategies and also sustainable financing in European Union. After that, we are going to have Q&A session. Now, we would like to invite the first speaker for the opening session. So the Joel Ivone, Minister, Counselor, and Deputy Head of Delegation of the European Union to the Republic of Korea, will give us the opening speech. So he is again the Deputy Head of Delegation of the European Union to the Republic of Korea.
I would like to wish you a good afternoon if you're based in the Republic of Korea, and a good morning if you are based in Europe. I'm very happy to welcome you all to our second virtual workshop organized by the Climate Action Project in partnership with the Energy Transition Forum. The previous webinar, which took place on the 25th of June of this year, generated a lot of interest, and I'm glad to see that there are many people joining our second virtual webinar today. Since our last webinar, a lot of international and local seminars and expert discussions have taken place, ranging from sustainable finance to hydrogen, with various stakeholders. Here in Seoul, the National Assembly has been very active in preparing a solid legal ground for the green transition of the Republic of Korea. Recently, during the virtual meeting of leaders, which took place on the 30th of June, President Moon Jae-in on the Korean side, President Charles Michel and President von der Leyen on the European side reaffirmed their commitments to combat climate change and to strengthen bilateral cooperation on Green Deal. President Moon also announced the government's plan on the Green New Deal last week, where the Republic of Korea would pursue carbon neutrality. Although the European Union very much welcomes the leadership of the Republic of Korea in Green Deal in the region, we also remain concerned that there might be a gap between policies and reality in the Republic of Korea. For instance, we have learned that the Korea Electric Power Corporation decided to continue investing in international coal power plant projects in Indonesia on the very same day where the summit was taking place. Achieving carbon neutrality by 2050 is not an easy task, but very challenging for both the EU and the Republic of Korea. Thus, I believe that this series of webinars will be an excellent avenue to address difficulties, to discuss ways to close the policy reality gap, and to facilitate necessary cooperation in making the green transition. I would like to reiterate that the EU is committed to achieving carbon neutrality by 2050 and to working with like-minded partners like the Republic of Korea. The Green Deal is a vehicle to steer our societies towards carbon neutrality by 2050. 2015 is a critical deadline. 2050, is a critical deadline if the world is to avoid the worst effects of climate change. However, reaching this objective will entail a transformation of our societies and economies, which will need to be cost-effective and just as well as socially balanced. The COVID-19 pandemic has been a harsh reality check. We simply cannot continue as before. As stated by the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, we have to build back better. The COVID-19 crisis is an opportunity to accelerate the transition to a cleaner world and to make a systematic change in our societies. I look forward to the lively discussions and I'm eager to learn from all of you. I thank you for your attention.
말씀 잘 들었습니다. 정말 감사드립니다.
Yes, thank you for your remarks. With that, I would like to move on to the next opening remarks to be delivered by the team leader of EU-Korea Climate Action, Joachim Eisler.
Yes, thank you. Also, a big hello and a warm welcome.
네, 감사합니다. 네, 저도 인사 올리겠습니다.
Which is an initiative that our EU-Korea Climate Action Project is actively supporting. The webinar or workshop that we are doing today, like Bong-hee said in her introduction, is part of a bigger picture, namely the support of the development of alternative low-emission development strategies for Korea. For those in the audience who is not so familiar with our project, allow me to say one or two sentences briefly about our EU-Korea Climate Action Project. What is it? What do we do? We are an EU-funded project that is supporting networking, knowledge sharing, and cooperation between Korean and European stakeholders, such as cities, universities, research institutes, private sector, with the objective to support climate actions and the transition to a low-carbon economy. And today's webinar is only one example of how we support this objective, sharing European and Korean approaches, experiences, and lessons learned. In this case, on challenges, opportunities, and lessons related to achieving 2050 net zero emissions in Korea and Europe. Let me also take the opportunity to thank the EU delegation in Korea, the Director General of Climate Action and Energy from the European Commission, for their support, as well as the Energy Transition Forum and our EU-Korea Climate Action Team to put this excellent workshop together and for the great work that has been done. In closing, I really would like to encourage all of you to keep visiting our website for additional information and to follow us on Twitter regarding some of our upcoming events. So please stay informed. Like it was said, we will upload a copy of this webinar along with the presentations also on our website. So it will be accessible to all of you. And I can reiterate again, please do stay in touch and follow us in terms of our next events as well. Thank you so much.
감사합니다. 요아임 팀장님. 마지막으로 이번 행사를 공동 주관.
Last but not least, I would like to hear from the co-representative of the Energy Transition Forum, Mr. Hong Jong-ho. But due to some inevitable schedule, he could not be with us in person, so he sent us the video. So now we'll watch his video.
안녕하세요.
Good afternoon.
에너지 전환 포럼
I am
상임 공동
Hong Jong-ho, co-representative of Energy Transition Forum.
한국과 EU가
First and foremost, I would like to express my great pleasure to see the opening of this webinar on strategies and policies to achieve 2050 net zero emission in EU and Korea, which is truly a grand and long-term goal in climate change policies. European countries have come up with specific and also very concrete policies, strategies to realize the net zero emissions, and they have also utilized various resources to achieve that. I have been particularly impressed by the efforts of European countries that they try to tackle both economic difficulty due to COVID-19 and climate crisis all at once with Green Deal, with the ultimate goal of achieving net zero emission by 2050. In other words, they have set and implemented very specific coupling strategies of economy and climate. I sincerely hope that today's webinar will provide us with a lot of opportunities to discuss EU's policy goals and tasks with regards to 2050 net zero emission. Korea, with Green New Deal, we should also strengthen our energy policies. When it comes to energy transition and climate response, I admit that the Korea was a latecomer, but we should no longer have the time to remain behind. Rather, we must pursue very aggressive and proactive energy transition policies. And in order to achieve our ultimate goal, which is to tackle climate change that affects the whole human society, now is the time for us, the government and the public, to make all-out efforts. I sincerely hope that through today's discussions and presentations, we'll be able to deepen our understanding in EU's efforts for 2050 net zero emission, and also to figure out where Korea should focus on to realize the same vision. We should also understand the perspectives of government, politicians, and the public on climate change, and we also have to think about where to change policies and how to induce policy changes, and also how we can strengthen the public acceptance for climate relevant policies.
특별히
So I hope that we can have ample opportunities to discuss on this. And also when it comes to climate change, financing is a very important issue. So I hope that these issues will be thoroughly discussed today. Once again, I would like to thank the presenters and discussants for their contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
이제 본격적으로
Yes, thank you for that. Now, let us cut to the chase and move on to the actual presentations and discussion session. Let me first introduce to you our moderator. Is an expert in climate action and environmental causes, professor of the Graduate School of Environment at Seoul National University, Ms. Sun-jin. He's also a director of the Energy Transition Forum. Professor Yoon, we have the microphone. Yes, good afternoon. My name is Sun-jin Yoon. As I was just introduced, I work at Seoul National University Graduate School of Environment, and I'm a director at the Energy Transition Forum. Now, today's webinar will be comprised of two sessions. Now, the first session will be about Korea. Is a 2050 net zero emission target in Korea possible? Will be the topic of the first session to be addressed by two speakers. And in session 2, the topic to be covered is strategies to achieve EU's 2050 net zero emissions target. And for this session, again, we have two distinguished speakers. So with that, let us begin session 1 on Korea. The first presentation will be delivered by Dr. Seongho Lee. Now, Dr. Lee is a chief researcher of Energy Policy Center at the Korean Institute of Energy Technology Evaluation and Planning. He will talk about the challenges and opportunities to achieve 2050 net zero emissions in Korea. The presentation is for 20 minutes. Yes, good afternoon. My name is Seongho Lee. Let's the content of my presentation. It's actually worked on by my fellow researchers, Dr. Jung Seok and Song Jung Seok in transport, and in the building side, Professor Mi-kyung Lee. Now, they've been in charge of the subsectors. And Professor Yoon is providing overall advisory service. And for each of the sectors, the responsible researchers are dedicated to that, and the professor overall advisory function was undertaken by myself and Professor Yoon. I'm only given 20 minutes for the presentation, so I will basically focus on how challenging the vision of achieving 2050 net zero emission is in Korea, and what sort of sub-targets shall we endeavor to achieve? Well, I will not touch upon that. We will give more time for us in the future to address those subtopics or sub-targets later on. Now, first, I'd like to move on to talk about Korea's climate policy trends. So now, Korea's international stature has risen. We're between 10th to 12th place in terms of GDP. And their energy consumption is growing continuously. However, we need to see decoupling, as we have seen in the advanced markets, in which they're able to achieve energy consumption reduction in a greener economy, while at the same time not compromising GDP growth. And recently, the government has announced the Korean version of a new deal, and Green Deal, so that all parties interested will take interest in green energy, green economy. And we believe that the current moment is offering more traction for the country to become more conscious and mindful of zero net emissions and carbon neutrality. Now, we are all familiar with NDC, which was 37% compared to BAU. but it has changed. We saw in 2017, changed to 20.4% in terms of absolute amount. And it's been divided into different sectors: industry, buildings, transport, waste, public, agriculture and livestock, etc. So there are emissions targets for each of these subsectors. And we are seeing increasing activity within the civil society as well. Our Energy Transition Forum was launched in 2018, and the following year, the Climate Action for Climate Crisis is also coming to being. And also in the same year, 2019, there's a Social Vision Forum for LEDS, a joint public and private endeavor. And after the general election of this spring, there's been increased discussion on 2050 net zero emissions. And with the recent announcement by the government on the Green New Deal, the public interest is heightened on this topic. Now, this is a 2050 Low Carbon Energy Forum. Now, these are the targets that were set forth at that event. And as for zero emissions by 2050, this is a target that has to be further worked on. And this webinar today is part of that effort to figure out ways to make feasible that 2050 target. There's interest in what the public perception on the topic is. There are a lot of public poll survey organizations that provide us with data. And we looked into the perception among the Korean people with regard to net zero emissions. We thought there was sort of a gap between the advanced countries and Korea. Okay, so within a year, we ranked 7th. Within 10 years, was 3rd. Within 30 years, was 2nd. And after the general elections of this spring, our local governments, 226 of them, came together and made the climate crisis declaration. And also on the 30th of June, the National Assembly of Korea adopted a resolution urging response to climate crisis. And there have been similar declarations or resolutions by the National Assembly in the following month of July. And these activities were followed suit by local autonomies to declare carbon neutrality, including decarbonization. And as you know, July 14th, the Korean government announced the Korean New Deal for carbon neutrality. No specific figures or numbers have been set for 2050, but it has been made explicit and clear that the overall direction to head in terms of energy use would be towards carbon neutrality. So the government, National Assembly, local governments, businesses, individuals should all come together, engage in active and productive discussion to approach a step closer to our Green Deal targets. Now let us look at what 2050 net zero means for us. Now, the ultimate energy that we used in 2017 was 301 million TOE. This is a big amount, so we believe that we could do better to reduce this by about 30 to 50% by 2050. And slashing this by 50% would give us 234 million TOEs, and if you convert, or actually 50% of 234 million would give us 117 million TOE, and converting to electrical power would give us 1,360.71 watt hours. And if the renewable energy would account for 60% of this, this would be equivalent to 70 million TOEs or 816 TWh. And in 2017, the total power generation amount will be 553 TWh. So you'll notice from these figures and calculations that this is very indeed an ambitious target. So both the government and the public should be aware of the level that we are seeking to achieve. And we all know that our economy is highly dependent on exports. So we will be able to maintain our economic and export competitiveness with the net zero emissions policy in place. Well, many stakeholders out there will be very keen to gain further insight on this. So they have to come together and bring out further brighter ideas to achieve this. So there are other industries in the area of energy transition that can grow, such as heat pumps, renewable energies, energy storage, or electric vehicles. So these are sectors and industry that we can focus growth on to achieve both ends at the same time. And there's also a social pillar, a social justice-driven transition. This also deserves a long-term national goal that has to be taken into account. And this entails an overall transformation in the energy system of the country. So individuals' behaviors and perceptions and mindsets must also change. So lifestyle and mindset and its transformation must also accompany our efforts along the path to achieve 2050 net zero emissions. I believe that it's a mission impossible, but without public perception and broad public consensus, we will not approach any closer to this ambitious target. Now, moving on to the power generation sector. Coal power generation accounts for still over 40%. LNG 20% and nuclear over 25%. Now, other sources, including renewables, account for less than 10%. Other countries have already exceeded the 26% mark, so compared to those advanced markets, we'll see that Korea is still lagging behind. And in this slide, this is the share of renewable energy in the energy mix among OECD member countries. On the far right, the red bar is our power generation from renewables. You'll notice that it's very minimal compared to other member states. And also in terms of generation capacity, you notice the share of renewables is relatively very small. And in other countries, coal, gas, nuclear are being reduced. But here in Korea, we're still building nuclear plants, coal-fired plants, gas-fired plants, and also for collective energy, which uses gas. Facilities for those are still being constructed, even as we speak. Nevertheless, given this big picture, we should adopt a long-term vision to jointly respond to the climate crisis in line with the international community. And I've set for myself some tentative targets that would help us to achieve this goal. Now, IEA Arena's target is to reduce greenhouse gases by 45% by 2030, net zero by 2050. And for renewables, that will take 85% of electrical generation, 77% of buildings, 63% of industry, and 58% for transport. But based on the assumption that power consumption will increase over the years in all of these different sectors, I came up with the generation capacity for different energy sources. So as of 2030, we need a capacity of 75 gigawatts in 2030, 180 gigawatts for 2040, and 400 gigawatts for 2050. Now, to give you a more tangible feel as to what this means, or nuclear, coal, and all that present together is 100 gigawatts. And if we change this to a distributed energy facility, incorporating PV and wind, we need 4 to 5 times energy feedstocks. So we have to pay closer attention whether this kind of energy mix, given the current pace, is possible in the future. Now, there's always this question raised by the public as to whether there is enough space available. For 1 gigawatt facility space, we need 10 square kilometers. So for 300 kilometers, we need 3,000 square kilometers, which is 3% of Korea's total land mass. So if this is the case, there is sufficient space for it to achieve this. The buildings that are currently existing and also the empty lots that could be utilized, and also forests and farmlands that are not being used for any arable purposes, we believe that they can contribute to the space to build renewable energy facilities. And in terms of cost, the land expense would be about 90 trillion won. And as for PV facility expenses, it's currently somewhat high, but we believe that this will further decelerate and become cheaper to be 150 trillion won. And with the annual PV generation, the income that we're able to generate a year will be about 40 trillion won. That's at a rate or a tariff rate of 100 won for 300 gigawatts at 1,314 hours. So I've talked about PV. Now there's also wind power generation. Now the Korean natural landscape is actually favorable for us to generate power through wind resources. And we believe that wind power generation is a necessity in order to minimize storage. And it is also economically viable. And in the interest of time, I would not go into details on this topic. And moving on. So PV and wind energy is an intermittent energy resource. So we need various flexible resource mechanisms to make up for those downtimes. So we need to transform the entire system to accommodate the intermittence of PV and wind energy resources and improve the supply system in line with international standards. And also the site plan should be established by the national government as the government takes leadership in formulating national road systems and other infrastructures. So we need to also think of realigning the entire power market and scheme systems altogether. Now these are some tasks in the energy area. We use a lot of energy in the industrial sector compared to other countries. For steel manufacturing, petrochemicals, etc. Now, POSCO as a single company, it's about 10% of total emissions coming from the business or industrial sector. And greenhouse gases have been increasing in the industry sector, and the companies and industrial emissions growth basically go hand in hand with economic development. Now, in the industrial side, account for about 70% into external emissions, and process emissions, which is actually internally generated, accounts for about 30%. So if we're able to accommodate this latter part, we believe we could reduce greenhouse emissions. So there are also technologies to enable that, including CCS, carbon capture, and storage. So if you utilize various technologies out there, I believe that this target is not impossible in my view. Now, I introduce in this slide an overseas scenario. This is the case of Germany. So notice that by 2030, CO2 cost is 100 euros. In 2040, 200 euros. This has to be the cost of CO2 in order for Germany to achieve the scenario targets. So depending on the price or cost of greenhouse gases, their targets can be achievable or rather hard to attain depending on what the value of the cost is. So Korea also set forth an 88% reduction target. That is why I gave you the case of Germany, which has come up with two scenarios, 80% reduction and 95% reduction. Now, industries that emit a lot of emission gases have set their own reduction targets and methods to achieve reductions. So enhance efficiency using biomass, electrification of some sectors and industries, for example. And also on the industrial side, as for the challenges and tasks that have to be addressed, Korea hopes to make an RE100 declaration sooner rather than later and make the environment more enabling for companies to achieve this target. Currently, we have the carbon credit trading system, which has to be more practical and more effectively put into practice to induce behavioral change. And also hydrogen power. This should also be incorporated in the steel manufacturing process to minimize or reduce the use of fossil fuel sources. And for cement, the external energy could be replaced with renewable energies, and the overall consumption could be reduced as well. And in terms of petrochemicals, we use a lot of hydrogen, so we can enhance use of hydrogens and replacing some of the energy itself with renewable energy sources. Now on the building side, the greenhouse gas emissions figures are stated here. As of 2017, buildings emit about 144.7 million tons of CO2 equivalent. And over 17 years from 2001 to 2017, the rate has increased on average 2%. There's heat accounting for 60% of the greenhouse emissions. So, converting the electrical power provided from the outside to renewable energies and the internal heat usage with renewable energy will be some other ways to enhance efficiency and power efficiency of the buildings to achieve this target. And others would be incorporating passive active schemes. I'm being notified that by 20 minutes we're almost up, so I'll go a bit faster. Next is the transport section. Consumption of energy has continuously grown over the years in Korea in transport. Despite the restrictions and laws against new vehicles that are high pollutants, we still see an increase in emissions of greenhouse gases coming from vehicles in the transport sector. And their cost of emissions is relatively lower compared to other markets, and this is an area that has to be worked on. So there are three areas that we have to work on. We need a roadmap for eco-friendly cars and low-carbon vehicles, which should be made more available to the public to enhance choice by consumers. Now, second, to enhance public transit or green transit, incorporate those ideas in the large urban transportation policies. So greenhouse gas emissions basically could be reduced by expanding the public transit network in a green manner. Now, third area would be civil or public participation and enhancing participatory governance. Now, this will be the last slide. Now, 2050 net zero emissions sounds like mission impossible to me at present. So in order to make it more feasible, to enhance the possibility of achieving this, we need wider public consensus. And if you want to replace fossil fuel altogether, even if you conserve on energy, you're not able to achieve the targets without replacing some of that with renewable energies. So we need systems, laws, the environment, and the public willingness to participate. And the markets for energy, gas, electrical power has to be aligned all together. That's an important task going forward. And the electrical power market has to become further liberal. And we also need reform in energy pricing systems and energy tax systems. And there's some laws that are being deliberated in the National Assembly today, Energy Transition Act or Carbon Tax Act. This discussion should bear fruit. I believe that such laws must be passed in order to achieve a 2050 net zero. So we have 2030, 2040, 2050 targets established in other markets. We should also follow suit and divide the larger goal into these sub-milestones. And we need further legislation to introduce a total energy use scheme for energies and also the internal combustion engine prohibition laws in the transport sector. And high carbon emitting products and industries would eventually lower our national competitiveness. And for land usage, we also need to realign or introduce new laws after comprehensively reviewing the existing legal framework on national land usage schemes. And we also need very meticulous or sedulous review of a socially just transition so that this transformation process will create new jobs and lead to energy welfare. And also the last part is governance. Only when everybody participates as important stakeholders can this target be achieved. And also a pan-governmental cooperative system should also be established. Thank you. Yes, thank you. That was a very brief 20-minute presentation. And he has delivered a presentation that was a compilation of the research and studies of many other fellow researchers. Now, details you weren't able to cover in the interest of time, but it's in the presentation material, so refer to them at your leisure. Now, 2050, net zero emissions is our end game. Now, what sort of policy efforts or policy frameworks are required should be a topic of further discussions to muster support along this path.
Next, we would like to hear from the Mr. Dae-Woong with regards to green financing, as it will be a critical tool to achieve our vision. Dae-Woong is the principal partner of ECO&PARTNERS, and he's going to give us a presentation on green financing for 2050 net zero. Yes, so good afternoon. I am Dae-Woong from ECO&PARTNERS. I am also the representative of the UNEP-FI. And from now on, I would like to begin my presentation on green financing for 2050 net zero. As mentioned by Dr. Seongho, what we need for net zero is money. So how we can secure financing for this vision, that's very, very important. I would like to first introduce the UNEP-FI. So the UNEP Finance Initiative. This is a public-private partnership between UN and financial institutions to achieve sustainable financing. About 330 banks and insurers and investment agencies are participating in the partnership. And they set out the principles and initiatives for sustainable financing. And here you can see the examples of the Korean members in UNEP-FI, including the major financial institutions as well as the financial supervisory services and so on. Why do you have to focus on finance? First of all, the size matters. Here you can see that the government budget for 2020 was about 215.3 trillion won, and Korea's nominal GDP is 1,919.4 trillion won. However, the AUM for 10 major financial institutions in Korea amount to 2,629 trillion won. And also the AUM for the total financial industry amounts to 6,347 trillion won. So how can we secure a certain percentage of money from the huge amount of money under management in financial institutions? So that's the focus of my presentation. For about 30 years, the financial institutions, they actually voluntarily started their efforts for green financing. But also within the recent 4 to 5 years, we started to establish systems for sustainable financing that make their participation mandatory. So I would like to talk about these trends. And along with the global trends, I would like to talk about the Korean situation as well. So this is my part 1 for the presentation. Here I want to talk about how financial institutions engage in sustainable financing as a bottom-up voluntary approach. So in fact, with this green financing, they can monitor ESG risk. That's why they have engaged in this effort. And also the major financial institutions today, therefore, have the green financing policies or sustainable financing policies. In other words, they say that they are going to actively pursue the ESG investment opportunities and also actively tackle the risks involved. So Korean financial institutes and also the global other financial institutions, they also have these sustainable financing policies. But compared with the foreign institutions, I think that the Korean financial institutions, yes, they do have the similar policies, but oftentimes these policies are not really put into action. So again, at the core of the sustainable financing policies will be the risk management and also the investment. But a lot of Korean financial institutions, they only focus on social contribution as a sort of the CSR approach. And here you can see that the foreign financial institutions provide the sustainable financing, including the examples of HSBC and Citigroup. So they promote investment opportunities through green financing. For example, the new and renewable energy, wind power, you see that they make a lot of investment. And in Korea, a very small number of financial groups, they establish brands for the financial services for green financing. However, their investment focuses only on so-called low-peak fruits. For example, the solar and PV, and also the green bond. That's another form of investment. And we have about 20 financial institutes that issue green bonds in Korea. Green bonds refers to bonds that are invested in the green technology and businesses 100%. But as you know, the definition for green is a little bit vague. And so that's why the Ministry of Environment in Korea, they have come up with the guideline for a green bond. And it's going to be declared or announced at the end of this year. And so in order to define the clear scope for green investment, the green taxonomy is critical. So as Korea is about to pursue the Green New Deal, a lot of projects will emerge, and in order to guide them into the right directions, I think we also need green taxonomy the Korean version of green taxonomy, and the Ministry of Environment is actually developing this taxonomy, and I believe that you can see the draft version of this taxonomy in the second quarter of this year, or third quarter of this year, sorry. So if this taxonomy becomes available in the third quarter of this year, then we have to continue to upgrade this taxonomy. So in European countries, green taxonomy is linked with the Green Deals, and I think Korea should follow suit. And also when it comes to financial institutes, the risk management is very critical. So I would like to talk about how financial institutions in European countries manage their risks. So the Korea's Exim Bank, it had served as export credit agency, and they have the long history of managing ESG risk. And also the Korea Industrial Bank and the Shinhan Finance Group, they have also adopted the ESG risk management for the first time among the private players. And as part of collective action, so for about 13 to 14 years, you see that the pension and also asset managers, they have come up with the voluntary sustainable financing principles. Basically, it talks about how to reflect the ESG risk in investment decisions. And also last year, the principles of responsible banking included the words climate change. It admits that the climate change is part of the financial risk. And also, according to the Green Financing Network, if we turn to the make energy transition and successfully enter into the 2 degrees Celsius society, then there will be a transition risk of 13.16%. And if we show no responses, then by 2030, the risk that we have to bear is about 6 to 7% of the GDP. And also by 2100, it will increase to 25% of the GDP. And in order to make transition to the 2 degrees Celsius society, then we have to cultivate new industries, including battery. So yes, we have to bear some short-term risk and pain, but if we can successfully make a transition, then we will be able to reap a lot of fruits. Now, I would like to talk about some top-down approach. So, in fact, the enforcement rules for the banking supervision in Korea, it also talks about the importance of the monitoring climate risk. So, here you can see the 3 pillars for the financial prudence. And the pillar 1 for the minimum capital requirements, yes, we already actively manage that. But for pillar 2 and pillar 3, Korea has not talked about that yet. Then Bank of England, back in 2006, they started to say that the climate change will negatively affect the real economy, and this will lead to the losses for insurers and also the banks. So the Bank of England says that the climate change could pose a threat to the insurance industry and also the banking industry, mainly led by the Governor Mark Carney. Mark Carney, he is a special ambassador to climate change. So back in 2016, during the G20 financial minister meeting, he suggested and he proposed the idea of establishing a study group on sustainable financing, and together with the Chinese central banks, he started to operate this study group. the Ministry of Planning and Finance in Korea was a part of this study group, but no longer so. And another important institution for G20 is FSB, Financial Supervisory Board. And they have assessed the financial impacts based on multiple scenarios of like 2 degree or 4 degrees Celsius scenarios. And also the FSB says that the financial institutions and also the non-financial industries should disclose the financial information in relation with climate change. And after that, in year 2018 and 2019, the EC Financial Stability Board, they have come up with the action plan for sustainable financing. And this reminded Korea of the importance of taxonomy. So today, Korea has the Green Financing Task Force, and FSS came up with the committee to pursue green financing as well. And NGFS was established mainly by the central banks and the financial supervision agencies back in 2018. So it includes a lot of the central banks and financial supervisory agencies. And also the Basel and IMF and BIS, they are also serving as observers for this organization. So it has come up with the 6 major recommendations that in monitoring the climate risks must be included in the monitoring for financial stability, financial supervision, investment portfolio, and also information disclosure system. And also the Bank of Korea signed and adopted this guideline. And the FSS also announced its intention to adopt this guideline. And also the NGFS has come up with the 6 major guidelines, as I mentioned earlier. So it's about the governance strategies for financial institutions, analysis on the 2-degree analysis sales scenario, and also assign the climate change risk duty to the executives of financial institutes. So far I have talked a lot about the global trends and initiatives. So you can see that globally there is a very, very strong pursuit of sustainable financing, but somehow Korea was lagging behind. But now we have a new momentum called Green New Deal. So not just the private sectors, I believe that the public sectors, the government offices, and the government leaders, they must participate in Green New Deal. So as a flagship project, we need the public Green New Deal projects. For example, the public bonds can be issued with the huge amount of like 2 trillion to 3 trillion won of financing. And also in order to prevent the New Deal from becoming the greenwashing, we have to develop the Korean version of green taxonomy. And also the ETS price must be stabilized in order to promote investment for Green New Deal. So the phase 3 ETS should be announced, but you know that there have been a lot of some criticisms. And also the public and private sectors making investment in Green New Deal, they have to be able to get some tax benefits and guarantees. So it's the private sector that hold a lot of money. So we have to have a green financing forum which can induce participation from private sectors. Green financing is becoming officialized with net zero. So BIS and also the IAIS, FSB, NGFS, they are all participating in the global trend of establishing global standards. And I believe that these global standards must be adopted by financial institutions in Korea. And for this, the public sector should take leadership so that the private sectors can follow suit. Then I believe that the 6,000 to 7,000 won of AUM in finance industry in Korea can be used for the green financing and climate change. So if we can establish the right financial system, then I believe that the Korea can surely achieve the net zero vision by 2050. Thank you very much. And thank you for keeping the time limit. I understand he's very, very punctual as he is engaged in working in the financial sector. And I think he touched upon very important element in a very short period of time. And also, in order to give sufficient time to our European presenters, I would like to, well, actually, I consider time limits for Korean speakers. So this is the end of the Korean session. And if you do have any questions, you can enter your question in the Q&A window. And about 100 people are online. So if you do have any questions, please raise your questions through the Q&A window. And also for our European audiences, if you do have any questions to the Korean speaker, again, please enter your questions in the question screen. And now we would like to move on to the second session.
Now, session 2 will cover strategies to achieve EU's 2050 net zero emissions target. There are 2 presentations. Their first presenter is Ms. Helena Viñes Fiestas, Global Head of Stewardship and Policy at BNP Paribas Asset Management. There's just been a presentation on sustainable finance by the Korean speaker. So Ms. Fiestas will talk about the sustainable finance of Europe and also the sustainable finance taxonomy and implementation methods in light of European New Deal and sustainable finance schemes. Please keep your presentations to within 20 minutes. Thank you.
Good morning and good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for your kind invitation. If you can please upload my presentation. Perfect. Thank you. Next slide, please. So in December last year, the European Commission presented the Green Deal, the European Green Deal, which is basically a roadmap for making Europe's economy sustainable by turning environment and climate into opportunities, and at the same time by ensuring that the transition is just. So we create also a much more inclusive economic model. Now, to cut a very long story short, I think that the key element of the Green Deal is the goal of Europe to become carbon neutral by 2050. More than that, the idea is to enshrine that goal into law. And this is actually that climate law is what is being discussed as we speak in the European Parliament. Now, in terms of sub-targets, so from 2050 overall goal, carbon neutrality by 2050, I would like to highlight 2 sub-targets, as I call them. The first one is to turn 1/4 of Europe's emissions that come from power generation to actually decarbonize 1/4 of Europe's emissions. So to really reduce all emissions coming from power generation. And at the same time, the other sub-target is to equally to electrify and therefore eliminate 1/3 of Europe's emissions that come from heating and mobility. So what we're talking about, it's a major and massive shift from an economy based on power generation, which in turn is based on fossil fuels, to one that is based in renewables. The plan is that up to 90% of the demand for power generation will come from renewables, and it would only be 10% left to a mix between CCS, hydrogen, and batteries. And the second shift is massive, or a shift to massive electrification when it comes to mobility. Now, the questions then that it posed, that the European Commission asked itself is, okay, how much do we need? You know, how many investments, how much money do we need to make to ensure that transformation? And it's really important to understand that it is not only about additional investments, but it's also about how we divert, how we redirect and change the trajectory of current financial flows to ensure that not only we fund new investments, so all new investments, the new investments that we need to make such a transformation, but at the same time that the rest of financial flows, that the rest of investments are anodyne. That means that they don't cause harm, that they don't become a burden to meeting that overall goal, which is carbon neutrality. Next slide, please. So this is the main reason why the sustainable finance, why finance is such a key element within the EU Green Deal. In fact, there is no transition without the financial sector. The financial sector is absolutely critical, and this is why it is the sustainable finance strategy of the Commission is one of the key pillars of that bigger structure, bigger house, which is the Green Deal. And as said, and I really want to highlight that, with that two roles in mind. On one hand, the expectation that the financial sector will be a force for good that will help to finance the transition, but at the same time that it will transform itself. So the question is, how do we also decarbonize the financial sector? How do we, how does the transition of the financial sector look like? And this is why, next slide. Next slide, please. Already as soon as March 2018, the European Commission released its roadmap on sustainable finance. So the strategy to start that transition for the sustainable finance sector. Now, the EC Action Plan, as it was also called, the roadmap was also called, it's a milestone in the history of the financial sector within Europe. And the reason why it's so important, and I remember when it came out at the very beginning, I was not so fully conscious of it. And now looking back, I realized to what extent, in March, it created an inflection point within the financial sector. The first reason is because it was the very first time that any region released such a comprehensive strategy that actually encompassed every single financial actor throughout the value chain of the financial sector. And you can see it in your slide, from companies and projects to households, going through banks, institutional investors, investment advisors, service providers, rating agencies, credit agencies, and so forth. And so that's one reason, and that's why the sustainable finance strategy was embedded within the Capital Markets Union strategy, and it was directed by the equivalent in Europe of the Treasury. Now, the second reason is because it asked every single actor throughout the value chain to integrate environmental, social, and governance risks. So ESG, as we call it, risk management, to become compulsory, and highlighting and underlining climate risks, as some of the previous speakers have mentioned, thinking about transition risk, physical risk, but also liability risks. If you can make one click so we can see just one click on the slide. Perfect, thank you. So what it did, the taxonomy, is to create different measures, actually 10 measures, targeting each one of the different financial actors throughout the value chain, as I said. But it was not only about integrating ESG and climate risks, right? Which the goal was, as I was talking before, to minimize the impact of financial flows and actually ensure that it doesn't become a burden to the goal, but also looking at how can we raise, what has become relatively famous in Europe, the 290 billion euros of additional investments per year in order to achieve the goals. And for that, to really start raising that amount of money, the first thing we need is to define what is a sustainable investment. If we do not know what is a sustainable investment, how can we monitor, track, or incentivize such investments? And this is what the EU taxonomy is. And I'm going to talk about it a little bit more at length in a minute. Next slide, please. So this is currently how the state of affairs. I'm not of the action plan. I'm not going to, in the interest of time, going through many of the details, but just to say that many of the action plans are already finalized in the sense of there is a regulations linked to it, or the action plan has been agreed, and we're waiting for either it comes into force or it starts applying. Of the 10 action plans, 4 were delegated to the expert group that I am a member of. So the Commission created a technical expert group on sustainable finance, and we were given the task to develop the taxonomy, to also develop some climate benchmarks, a green bond standard, European green bond standard, and to develop some guidelines on climate-related disclosures. The guidelines, and I think this is an important point, or the beauty of those guidelines, was that we took the TCFD, the task force from the G20 task force, climate-related disclosure recommendations, and we look at the current framework and legislation in Europe for disclosures, the non-financial reporting directive, and we aim to merge both. We went even further because we also started integrating disclosures directly related with the taxonomy, or looking at specific indicators, something that the task force recommendation doesn't do. Next slide, please. So I'm continuing talking about the importance of the disclosures. Disclosures are key, but they're just the means towards an end. But yet, if we want investors and banks to really take into account climate-related risk, you need the underlying information. And not only you need the underlying information, but you need that information to be comparable, to be reliable, to be meaningful, to cover the entire activities of a company, and so forth. And this is why the disclosures, everything that's related to disclosures, it's such a big element of the action plan in the Commission, on the sustainable finance strategy, European strategy. Now, for the very first time, both packages, so there were disclosures that are targeting companies with the revision of the non-financial reporting directive and the upgrade of the guidelines, as I was speaking, and at the same time, disclosures for investors, so asset managers and asset owners, and we envision very soon disclosures for banks and rating agencies and other actors. Now, one of the very unique elements of these new, let's call it, wave of demands, is the inclusion of what is called the concept of double materiality. Let me explain here. Up to now, when we talk about environmental, social, and governance risks, and in this case, we're concentrated on climate risk, we talk about the risks to the investment of the company. So how climate change impact me as a company. Now, what the new wave of regulation on disclosures, as I was mentioning, introduces is that it's not only about the impact it can have in my investments, but it's also about the impact my investment can have on the environment and society. And in this case, on how my investments might interact with climate change, might actually make climate change worse. And this is a big step forward. I would also say that in Europe, as we speak, the rules on fiduciary duties for investors are changing, and they are integrating precisely the double concept of materiality. Next slide, please. So on the green bond standard, I won't spend much time, but just to say that it's voluntary, that it builds on best market practices, that it is applicable for EU or any international green project, so it doesn't have to be European. However, it has to be aligned with the EU taxonomy. Remember, the EU taxonomy defines what is sustainable, so it has to be sustainable. And another new thing is that it has to be verified by accredited verifiers, which is also an innovation within the market. Next slide, please. Now, the EU taxonomy. I was saying that the EU taxonomy, actually, it looks more like a dictionary, that anyone can look at it and to see whether or not an economic activity is sustainable and under which conditions. The way it works, it's with what I call the double conditionality framework, which basically means that for one economic activity to be included, it needs to contribute substantially to one of the environmental objectives, in this case, let's say climate mitigation, and on the other hand, it cannot harm. And when it comes to not harming, we mean not harming any of the other environmental objectives. So if we talk about climate mitigation, that it doesn't harm ecosystems, or it doesn't harm marine resources, etc. But at the same time, it cannot harm any social standard. And this is why in the taxonomy regulation, because the taxonomy is governed by a regulation that has been approved and already published, very recently published in the European Journal, it has to comply with minimum social standards. And those social standards, the reference point are international standards. So the OECD multinational guidelines, or the UN Guiding Principles of Business and Human Rights, and the International Labour Organization on labor standards. I want to highlight the very much importance of this concept of do not significant harm, whether we talk about the environment or we talk about society. It is a step forward. I think that in financial industry, we need to recognize that in the past we haven't been very good on dealing with the trade-offs. Next slide, please. I was mentioning about 6 environmental objectives. You have them in front of you. Those 6 environmental objectives reflect the 6 environmental objectives at the EU level. For each one of them, there is a strategy, or about to be a strategy. That I understand that the circular economy new strategy will be published anytime this year. And for each one of them, there are targets and sub-targets. So for instance, for climate mitigation, we have the target of carbon neutrality, and the 2030 targets we are about to change. And we hope that while they are revised, the EU countries commit to 50 to 55% of emissions reductions by 2030. Now, one of the things that is very important to understand, as Korea might think about adopting or developing its own taxonomy, or adopting the EU taxonomy with some modifications, is that the beauty of the taxonomy is that it is based on 2 key pillars. One is that it's consistent with those environmental objectives. So for climate mitigation, it is consistent with the 2050 carbon neutrality, and anticipates regulatory and policy link risk, and at the same time is scientific and evidence-based. Next slide, please. So in practice, what does it mean? So what you have in front of you, it's an early graph of the 250 long-term strategy, so on the Green New Deal. And you can see how steep those lines are. We need to be conscious that if we want to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, what science is telling us, and the taxonomy is very much based on the IPCC 1.5 degree report and International Energy Agency 2018 report, is that we need to accept that no new unabated generation of electricity or infrastructures from fossil fuels can be made. And the transition to a low carbon economy will involve the phase out of some economic activities, such as unabated fossil fuel-based power generation. But it's also important to know that a taxonomy is technology-free, which basically means that if CCS becomes economical and it meets power generation with CCS meets the conditions of the taxonomy, then it can perfectly be in the taxonomy. Next slide, please. So I invite everyone to look, and I'll give you the link at the end of my presentation to take a look at our report. It sets thresholds and metrics for each one of the activities. There are 7, grossly speaking, big sectors for the time being. All the activities included in the taxonomy represent, meaning the sectors that we looked at, represents 93.2% of all the emissions within the EU. For each one of the sub-activities, because they are at a quite detailed level, we have set up thresholds that will set the pathways for those activities towards carbon neutrality. Next slide, please. So the overall next slide, please. So the overall goal is that as companies' activities become taxonomy aligned, the total emissions, reduce. Very quickly, I would say that the taxonomy applies at activity and asset level, not at company level. It's not an assessment on companies, but on their activities and the pathways of their activities. And part of the regulation will force all EU companies that are under the scope of the directive, the non-financial reporting directive I was mentioning at the beginning, will need to disclose the percentage of the revenues and CapEx and OpEx that are aligned with the taxonomy. But at the same time, all investors for any fund that we say that has environmental characteristics, we will need to disclose the percentage of the fund that relates to the taxonomy. Next slide, please. So basically creating a common measurement tool. So all our clients will be able to compare our funds, 2 funds with the same metric and say which one is greener than the other one. Next slide, please. So I think I'm running, I think I only have a few minutes left. Next slide. Next slide, thank you. So that's, grossly speaking, how the taxonomy works. And the taxonomy now, obviously, I represent financial institutions, and finance, as climate change and the environment, they don't understand about borders. So it's really important that we work together towards the development of a global taxonomy. And even if every region and some countries have their own taxonomy, what we can really share is the framework, the principles. The financial industry will ask you, and on behalf of them, if you allow me, that please don't reinvent the wheel. Use the skeleton of the EU taxonomy. We need the double conditionality. We need to use the same metrics. What it might change is your environmental objectives and the timings and some of the local specificities. But we can share, as said, that framework, and that would really facilitate the transition at a global level and the change or transformation of financial flows. This is why last year in October, if I recall correctly, the Commission launched an international platform on sustainable finance. Today, there is 50% of the global emissions represented, 50% of the global population, and 45% of the global GDP. It will be great to see South Korea in it. The purpose of the platform is to start working precisely on how can we share some of that financial frameworks on sustainable finance, so we facilitate the transformation for our financial sectors, but also that we can ensure that we can raise the necessary funds for our economies to transform. Next slide. I won't spend too much time on this, but just to let you know that on the that the European Commission already announced that the EU taxonomy will guide investments in Europe as part of the recovery package. We need to ensure that the recovery doesn't hurdle and doesn't postpone, the implementation of the Green Deal and the transition. Just the opposite, that it accelerates and acts as a catalyst, because it is the green growth strategy that is going to help us create the necessary jobs, and that is going to help us to create the resilience that we need. What the COVID crisis demonstrated is that we are not ready, that we need to develop resilience in our healthcare systems, our economy, and our financial sector. And that goes through the transformation of our economies. Next slide, please. And I will finish with this by saying that today I show you the key elements of the current sustainable finance strategy, but as we speak, the Commission, and we're helping them, is developing the new EU sustainable strategy, or as it calls it, the Renew strategy, that takes some of the elements that haven't been finished of the past strategy and incorporate it in a new strategy that is even more ambitious. And one of, for me, key elements of this new strategy is about what is the role of the public sector in relation to its own investments, in relation to its budgeting or procurement and public link pensions and central banks investments as asset owners. And I think that the response for us, for the tech members, is that the taxonomy has to play a key role in those. And with further delay, just next slide, please. I thank you for your attention. And if you can just click one more time, and hopefully you will, next one, there you go. And you have the link where you can have access to our reports and all the detailed explanations on the EU taxonomy. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. It was an excellent learning opportunity. We went slightly over the 20-minute limit, but it was well worthwhile. There was much to learn, a very meaningful presentation. Now, with that,
Director of Innovation and Technology from IRENA, and his title is changed a little bit. As you know, in Korea, in the industry sector, in fact, Korea does have very energy-intensive industry, and therefore energy transformation in industry sector is very critical and very difficult for Korea. And in this sense, I believe that we can learn a lot from EU. And in this sense, I believe that his presentation will give us a lot of lessons. So Dolph Gallen will start his presentation. I will give you 20 minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much, Madam Moderator, and thank you very much to the organizers for giving IRENA the opportunity to present our perspective on this. To give you a little bit of context, IRENA is the International Renewable Energy Agency. We have 161 members, so Korea is one of our members, and the European Union is also a member of IRENA, and our task is to advise our members on their potential for renewables and for energy transition. My presentation has 3 parts. I will show you a bit of two best cases for energy transition and renewables deployment in Europe. I will talk a little bit about the potentials we see in East Asia and how that compares to the global potentials. And then I will focus on the industry potentials in Korea. So talking about the European energy transition, that is progressing well. So in the first half of this year, the share of renewable power reached 42%. And this year, the objective is a 20% renewables share in gross final energy and a 20% energy efficiency gain compared to 1990. And it looks like there will be even a slight overshoot because of the crisis. Now, the objectives at the moment are 32% renewables and 32.5% efficiency gain by 2030. So for both more than a percentage point improvement per year. And it's likely that these two objectives will be increased further, because it was already mentioned the CO2 abatement target will be increased. It's going to be 40% for 2030. It's likely to go to 50 to 55%, and that can only be achieved through more renewables and through more efficiency. And that CO2 target needs to be increased to reach the net zero CO2 emission objective for 2050. So renewable power will dominate in European power systems in the coming years. That can only be achieved through also adjustments in the enabling grid systems and also through market design adjustments. And net zero carbon longer term requires not only a transition in power, but also in the end use sectors. So we need to think about solutions for buildings, industry and transport. And that's currently very much at the heart of the energy transition discussion in Europe. So energy transition is not only seen as an energy and climate policy, it's also very much seen as an industry policy in Europe. There are a few clear examples. So Europe is currently the world leader in offshore wind, for example. You see also a very rapid deployment now, but also ramp up of manufacturing capacity of electric vehicles, and also important efforts in other areas, for example, in hydrogen steel making. Now, I'll give you two examples of countries that have made significant progress in this area and experience in that. So first example is the power sector transition in Germany. So that is a process that started already nearly 30 years ago. It has been a long process, but there has been significant progress. So in 2000, 6% was renewable share in power generation in Germany. First half of this year, it was 54%, and the target is 65% renewables by 2030 in power generation. There were two main drivers. One was reduced import dependence, also very relevant in a Korean context. The other one was the phase out of nuclear that was decided after the Fukushima accident. And so 2022, the last nuclear reactor will go will be closed in Germany. Now, there have been changes in the enabling policy framework. There are still some issues to be dealt with in terms of the grid, enabling grid transformation, notably north-south transmission grid lines that are a bit delayed, but that are being built right now. And as the share of renewables has grown above 50%, now there is much more attention for the issue of sector coupling, and especially green hydrogen is currently given a prominent position to enable further transition towards renewables, also variable renewables in the power system. So the main message here is it is possible to build large power systems with high shares of variable renewables, of solar and wind. And of course, that's also very relevant in a Korean context. But also Germany, an important enabling factor in Germany has been that this has been done in cooperation with the neighboring countries. So that's maybe also something that deserves more attention in a Korean context. Now, the second example is the district heating and greening of the gas system in Denmark. So Denmark is similar to Korea in a sense that district heating plays an important role, but Denmark has made an important transition from fossil fuel-based district heating to renewables-based district heating, and the rollout of district heating as an enabling system to introduce more renewables continues apace. And then also new innovative solutions are being introduced into these district systems, heating systems. So for example, the use of surplus renewable electricity from wind in combination with heat pumps in district heating systems, or also now more recently solar systems with seasonal storage of heat. Now on the gas grid, there are also interesting developments in Denmark. So there is a strong drive to introduction of green gas, notably biomethane produced from biogas. And so in the first half of this year, Denmark had 13 to 15% biomethane in its gas system, and that percentage is projected to grow significantly further in the coming years. Of course, in the initial phase, costs are still significant. About half of the cost is at the moment subsidies, but that's projected to decline in the future. So point here is that energy transition is not only about power systems. There are also opportunities to scale in district heating systems and in gas systems, and maybe that's also worth some attention in the Korean discussion. Now, looking at power systems, of course, the transition there is also very much driven by the favorable economics. We have seen very significant cost reductions for renewable power in recent years. So our latest assessment from June this year showed these numbers shown here on this slide. And we expect that the cost reductions will continue in coming years. And of course, that makes then the case for renewables based on economic grounds. Now, looking forward, we need much more renewable power worldwide. We need to grow from, in the case of wind, to around 5,000 gigawatts from around 500 gigawatts today. We think that Asia will be the prime market, both for onshore wind, shown on the left here, and for offshore wind, shown on the right. Of course, in East Asia, China is the largest market, but we think that there are also interesting opportunities and important opportunities in Korea and in Japan. And looking at the economics, the levelized cost of electricity, you see that the prices are not that different from other world regions. So that also speaks then for the economic case. And for solar, it's even more remarkable. We think that the bulk of the solar potential is in Asia, notably in East Asia. And again, the levelized cost of electricity is still slightly higher than the global average, but it's converging. So now moving to the industry sector. Each year we issue our global renewables outlook. The last one was in April. That shows transition pathways. For the first time, we've looked at a deep decarbonization pathway towards net zero or even zero CO2 emissions in the 2050-2060 context. And then when you do that type of analysis, it becomes very clear that industry and transport, specific parts of transport, are the hard to decarbonize sectors, and finding solutions there is something that many people are currently looking at. We find that technically it is feasible. The economics still needs some improvement to go to these deep decarbonization pathways. We are currently looking at that in more detail as part of our Reaching Zero report that will be issued end of August. And in that context, we looked specifically at a number of industry sectors. So the energy intensive industries account for about 2/3 of global industrial energy use and CO2 emissions. And then we're talking about iron and steel, chemicals and petrochemicals, cement, aluminium, and a few other energy-intensive materials. Now, these are also very relevant in a Korean context, because the Korean economy is remarkably energy-intensive, and that is especially because you have a very strong industry sector, and where especially also the energy-intensive industries are important. If you look at the energy use breakdown, if you include also the feedstock and blast furnaces and coke ovens, etc., then iron and steel industry accounts for around a quarter. Chemical and petrochemical industry accounts for half of energy use in manufacturing industry in Korea. So these two are really critical. And looking at the volumes of production, then so you see that also reflected. Korea is a large producer of cement with more than 50 million tons. Also a large producer of steel, and especially primary steel from basic oxygen furnaces, so from iron ore, and also has a very strong petrochemical sector with a lot of production of plastics and other types of petrochemical products. So if you want to consider net zero CO2 emissions in Korea, you have to look at what can be done in these industry sectors, and especially iron and steel and chemical and petrochemical. Now, there are a number of solutions that can be applied in industry. Of course, throughout energy efficiency is important, throughout the electrification of processes in combination with clean electricity supply, notably renewables, can be important. But we see also some new emerging solutions, such as the use of green hydrogen from renewable power, such as the use of biomass feedstocks, and such as a much more wide deployment of circular economy concepts to reduce the energy demand in these industries. This transition is urgent because the capital stock turnover rates in these industry sectors are quite long, in the order of many decades. So if you want to have net zero emissions by 2050, you need to start now. So what we see as solutions is shown here in pie charts. I mean, these are global numbers. You really have to look into the national specifics to see what it means in a national context. But you see that both for iron and steel, and for chemicals and petrochemicals, and for cement and lime, we see the use of renewable electricity, energy efficiency in combination with circular economy, the use of hydrogen and other types of synthetic fuels produced from clean electricity, notably renewable electricity, and the use of CO2 capture and storage as essential components. But the shares may somewhat vary depending on the national conditions. So across all the end-use sectors, including industry, we think that electrification is very important. That includes direct electrification, so where you replace fossil fuel use in industrial processes with electricity use. It also includes replacement of processes with the use of green hydrogen. For example, in iron making, there's an interesting opportunity to replace coal and coke with the use of hydrogen for the production of direct reduced iron, but also in some of the chemical industry processes such as ammonia production and methanol production. There are opportunities to shift from fossil fuels to the use of green hydrogen. And we think that overall a 50% electrification rate on a global scale should be feasible by 2050. So that's really an important strategy. Now, hydrogen can be produced in many ways. There are roughly three main categories today. We have mainly gray hydrogen produced from fossil fuels with important CO2 emissions. Today, about 1% is green hydrogen produced with renewable electricity, and about 1% is what is called blue hydrogen, fossil fuels with CCS. We think that there needs to be a shift to 2/3 green hydrogen, 1/3 blue hydrogen by 2050, and we think that the total use of hydrogen may double or even quadruple by 2050 compared to today's level. So hydrogen becomes a very important energy carrier, clean energy carrier, because of its ability to decarbonize various end-use sectors, but also definitely industry. And these processes are being introduced as we speak now. So there was an interesting announcement from Saudi Arabia last week that they're going to build now a large green ammonia plant in Saudi Arabia that should become operational in the coming years, and other countries are also now moving in that direction. Now, of course, Korea has a challenge in a sense that it's a densely populated country and a very energy-intensive economy. And of course, the question then is there sufficient space to produce all that renewable energy? Well, there is also an interesting strategy that can overcome that problem, and that is to outsource the energy-intensive process steps. And to give you one example for iron, so today Korea imports iron ore from Australia, and it imports coking coal from Australia. But you could also switch to the import of hydrogen-based direct reduced iron from Australia instead of importing iron ore and coking coal. So such a strategy, you can tap into the renewable electricity potential in Australia. You would still keep most of the value added in Korea. So I think these type of relocation strategies must be considered if we talk about zero carbon emission economies in the coming decades. And the costs look quite affordable at around $70 per ton of CO2. Now, petrochemicals is the other key sector in a Korean context. That is a challenging sector to decarbonize. Hydrogen can play some role, but the bulk of the carbon is in fact stored in products such as plastics, and the CO2 emissions from the use of these plastics is only released during incineration in the post-consumer phase. So ways to avoid fossil fuel feedstock include biomass feedstock and more recycling of waste materials. In both areas, there are important efforts. At the moment, economics are the main challenge here, because today it's roughly twice as expensive. So there's continued efficiency improvements are needed, and continued attention for economies of scale is needed to bring these options to the market. One of the main challenges across all the energy-intensive industries is how do you ensure that your industry remains competitive, and how do you prevent carbon leakage? So that's also an area where governments need to step in and create the right enabling framework. And in a European context, for example, there's discussion about border tax adjustments to deal with the competitiveness issue. Now, final sector is cement. That's a particular sector because of the high share of process emissions. It's more than half of the total CO2 emissions. So in that sector, CO2 capture and storage must play a role. If you combine that with the use of biomass or waste fuels, then you can also look into biomass CCS, and the combination of the two could yield net zero cement kilns. So, but also circular economy concepts, replacement of feedstock needs to play a role to really get to zero emissions in this sector. It's very much delayed the progress here. At the moment, there's 1 or 2 demonstration plans, and that you can compare that to 6,000 working cement kilns worldwide. So there is a big step needed to transition to net zero emissions in this sector globally. Finally, we need an enabling framework. I've addressed a few of the issues of the enabling frameworks in my comments. There is a clear opportunity for a global sectoral approach in industry, and I think that it would be very favorable if Korea and Europe could cooperate in this area. And with that, I conclude my remarks. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yes, thank you very much. We have had presentations from 4 speakers. There are about 4 questions on these presentations that have been delivered. Now, the participants, if you have not uploaded your questions, please type them in. Now, there are 2 approved questions here. Okay. Wait, please hold on a minute. As for webinar procedure matters, I approve 2. What do I need to do from now on? Okay. Okay, there was the first question that was uploaded. EU Green Deal and overseas Green Deal projects are possible because they're market-oriented policies, but RPS fixed price system in Korea Is that possible to create a renewable energy market? Because I believe that all policies have to incorporate market policies as well as realistic regulations. Currently in Korea, both are not working in sync at the moment. So would it work? Is it workable in Korea? Mr. Lim, would you like to answer the question? Yes, I understand where you're coming from. There's an RPS for the supply of renewable energy in Korea, and if you want to implement the RPS, that would make financing difficult in reality. But RPS, it began with financial institutions being motivated or incentivized to enter into the renewable sector. Now, there is an example overseas. In the UK, for example, they began with FIT, and then shifted to ROZ, renewable obligations, and then decided that it's not feasible in terms of financing. So they switched it today to contract for different CFD. So you have the lowest price and the highest price. So there's a floor and a ceiling to enable more viable financing. So as you pointed out, the current renewable energy policies in Korea are not adequate for financing flows. So we need to strengthen or make more efficient the financing portion as part of the larger policy scheme. So we can't do all at once. So I think we should focus on the EU Green Deal investment plan as a reference, as a starter. About 1 trillion euros is going into Invest Euro. It's like a guarantee fund. So if that has been formed, I think the Green Deal projects could be carried out without any risk of potential loss or any skepticism. So on this question, would an expert in Europe offer any advice or insight on policies related to financing, how policies can go in tandem with financing? We began with RPS and with currently modifying FIT, but it's not a complete FIT system, feed-in tariff system. So stakeholders and investors are not being able to recover fully their investment. So with regard to policies and its linkage with financing, if you have any insight you'd like to share with us, we greatly appreciate that.
I'm trying to understand. I'm not sure I got the whole question. I think the question was to what extent, what sort of policies should the EU put in place in order to ensure that investors can recuperate their investment, right? That there are enough returns. Is that the question? I think I'm speaking now from my from a perspective of an asset manager. I think that the story that green investments were not sufficiently profitable, it's a story of the past. I think that what we have seen in the last few years, it's an incredible drop of the cost of renewables, the price of renewables, to the extent that today in some regions and in some areas, some of the renewables, and I'm sure Dae-Woong has a lot to say about this, can be even more profitable and are the most profitable energy source. You know, that has been the case, for instance, in Chile with the solar. It has been the case of onshore wind in some regions and so forth. In fact, what we see is that when we analyze the oil and gas sector, what we've seen is a decline on demand, irrespectively of the crisis and of the crisis, and an industry that it is at its crossroads, and that has made some of the CEOs of some of the biggest oil and gas companies in the world saying that the future is not one of oil and gas, it's one of electricity. What we need to do is to transform our business models into energy companies. And what we expect as investors is those companies to start, which some are really doing, diversifying their portfolios and start investing not only in renewables, but in some of areas around electrification. So I think that from my perspective, yes, maybe some low carbon technologies are not profitable. I think there is a big question mark about the economics on CCS today. But generally speaking, low carbon technologies, many of them are becoming more and more profitable, and definitely it's not the case of most renewables. With that, I pass it over to Dae.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, maybe to add, I showed some of the cost numbers also for Korea and the region, and they looked quite in line with what we see globally. And so we see that costs have come down to a level where renewables are, in many places, the lowest cost supply option. Of course, in a Korean context, probably rooftop PV and offshore wind are the two key ones. The cost for offshore wind are still a little bit higher than what it is in Europe. But I'm sure as the industry grows, cost will continue to come down very fast. What we see, we are just completing another study looking at the G20 and the cost differences between the countries. And what we see is that it's economies of scale are important, but also you need to make sure that there is not too much red tape in the enabling framework. If you have very long planning procedures, if you have uncertainties in your approval procedures, that drives up the cost of capital. So if you can streamline that a bit, it really helps also in the transition.
Yes, in my view, I think Korea still has a lot of ground to cover compared to Europe. We talked about cost, there was a comparison. Korea's cost structure is still higher relatively. Electricity bills and energy tax systems have yet to reach a level of Europe. So when it comes to cost issues, even with the generation cost of renewable energies fall, we have still ways to cover for grid parity. So we need improvement in legal systems and also electricity tariff system reform. And energy tax systems should also be revised because at present they're very different from the systems in Europe. So without addressing these issues, I think our pathway could be quite challenging. Now another question here is actually the last question that was uploaded. So question about Europe. With regard to climate change and energy transition, we agree that we need public consensus and public interest on those topics. But in Korea, the 2050 net zero, I'm not sure if all Koreans are showing active interest on the topic and have faith in the feasibility. Dr. Lee has talked about in his presentation earlier. If we ask the Koreans if they feel that climate change is serious, well, the Korean people would answer, according to Gallup polls, say that it is serious, as much as those people living in other countries. But in Korea, there are also other issues and problems aside from climate change. There's issues of economic development, employment, low birth rates, aging populations, unification or peace on the Korean Peninsula. If you look at these other wider issues and challenges, the relative severity or the priority of climate change is actually further down the list to 7. So what are some of the ways that we could further incite or encourage the public to show more interest on this topic? In Europe, what sort of interest are they showing on this topic? And how were the countries in Europe able to muster public support and interest in this area? The Green Party, they account for about 10% in the parliament and in Germany. The Green Party in 12 states have established a coalition with the other parties thus garnering greater momentum to implement policies quite efficiently. But the situation politically is not the same here in Korea. Of course, there are historical pathways that differ, and the level of industrialization, the perception on environmental issues, the history and the cultural mindset between the two regions are different. Given that, however, we believe that in order to incite greater interest on the topic in Korea, we should learn from the example of Europe. That is why I'm asking this question to the speakers. So the people in Europe, what's their interest in climate issues like? And to establish that high level of interest, what sort of policies or campaigns or efforts were effective to bring about that result?
Shall I start? I think that I would mention a couple of things, and please take into account that I am not a policymaker and I don't represent any government. So I'm a private, I represent a private institution, so an investment fund. So please, my take is that awareness in Europe, and if we were to, and I know there are multiple polls that have been done, and the results would vary also from country to country, but also depending on the personal conditions of the people that respond. But I could say that climate change, grossly speaking, is high up in the agenda. Now, I think the crisis, the context, the current context that we're experiencing, it is going to be a very good test to see to what extent we've been successful in linking, in really sending three key messages that for me are very important to transmit. The first one is that climate change is first and foremost a social issue. What we're talking here about, it is about the impact on the health of human beings and on the potential of our livelihoods. What it is at risk is our own livelihoods and our own economic system. So we're not talking about an environmental issue isolated. This is not something that the tree huggers, keep pushing. This is about the future of our economy. And what, for me, it is obvious, and what BNP Paribas Asset Management has sent the message very strongly is that if we want to ensure, our pensions in the future, if we want to ensure, future returns, we need to transform our economic model. And we need an economic model that is low carbon, that is environmentally sustainable, and is much more inclusive. And other than that, what we are going to hinder, first and foremost, is our economy and then our livelihoods. I think that, once again, the crisis has portrayed to what extent we're not ready. I said it before about resilience. The COVID has been proved, it's not me saying it, but many scientists, the links of the current pandemic with biodiversity loss, with deforestation. So if we don't address these issues, we are going to really suffer, and our health, will suffer as well. And I already made that point. So the first thing is to make really people aware about the importance of climate change from a social and economic perspective. The second point is that if we look at job creation in the past and the potential of job creation, the biggest areas of growth is particularly on low carbon technologies, and on the green is, the future growth story is green, and it's in these areas and where future growth and the most potential for job creation comes about. What we are experiencing, and here is the angle probably that I know best, as investors, we analyze all the sectors of the economy. What you see today is that whether we talk about the oil and gas sector, the electric utilities, automobiles, aviation, these are sectors that are at the crossroads. And if those sectors do not transform itself, the companies within those sectors don't transform themselves, we're going to see many of these companies, seriously suffering. I used to be a pharma analyst years ago, and for me, sometimes when I see these companies, I see the pharmaceutical industry 10 years ago, when it refused to accept, the transformation into biologics and continue with the current model. And most of the biggest pharmas not only had to restructure themselves, very rapidly when they had no more, room for maneuver, but it came with a big social cost. So what we're asking the companies within the different sectors is, please start transitioning. Yeah, please take into account also the social impact in your transitions. We have 30 years to achieve carbon neutrality. In less than 10, we need to reduce 50% of productions. We no longer have, what we need now is major transformation. And I think that these messages need to be sent to the population. They need to make the link between their future, jobs, their pensions with the transition. Thank you.
Thank you. I think a lot of experts in Korea, we deliver the same messages, but those messages do not really resonate loud in Korea. But I appreciate your comment. In overcoming the COVID-19 crisis, yes, together with the economic challenges, we also have to think about the ecological issues and also how COVID-19 is related with climate change. And we are devising some messages and trying to deliver these messages, but somehow the society doesn't really resonate loud in our society. And now the Mr. Lim, he has a question. So I would like to give him the opportunity to raise the question. So I would like to ask a question to Helena, Viñes, Fiestas. So you talked about the EU's green financing initiative, and I hope that the Korea could be part of the EU's sustainable financing platform. My question is, how Korea can create momentum for green financing? I would like to hear about your advice for that. Yes, I know that there may be some limitations in understanding of Korea's situation, but if you could offer us some advice, then I will highly appreciate. And also the BNP Paribas asset management firm, it has the subsidiary in Korea as a form of joint venture. So what kind of activities do you have in Korea, and what's your plan for the Korean market?
Well, so on the first question, I have to recognize that my knowledge, I don't feel fitted to provide any specific comment or advice on the Korean economy, on the Korean financial sector, because that's not part of my role. I head the policy on sustainable finance and stewardship, which means the voting in companies and engagement with companies. So I will refrain myself to answer you by telling you about what have been probably some of the key factors for success in Europe. Yeah, I mean, and success within inverted commas, because we are working on it. Yeah, I think that we will be able to say whether or not it has been successful in a few years' time when we look back and we can see whether or not the policies and the roadmap has been successful. I think one of the first thing of the matters, and I mentioned it in my presentation, is that for the very first time, the agenda was driven by the Treasury. So in the case of the case of Europe, by DG FISMA, which is the equivalent of the Treasury. So it was what we had seen in the past is most of the policies were either coming from the environmental type of ministries, or they were coming from the Treasury, but they were isolated and they will target one actor or the other. The sustainable finance strategy, when it became really powerful, is because it was driven by FISMA, and it was not only FISMA, even if they drove the agenda, it was in coordination with other DGs, so environment and climate, and now the next renew with energy as well, and at the same time based with the ecosystem of EU institutions, which includes the European Investment Bank, the European Environmental Agency. We've seen the fantastic declarations of Madame Christine Lagarde with respect to the European Central Bank. So I think that if not knowing your structure, it needs to be driven by your treasury, but in conjunction with that ecosystem, that financial ecosystem. The second point is that the Commission did not sit on one corner and develop the strategy. It invited experts to help them develop. And those experts were representing the different stakeholders of, in the economy. And I think that for us, BNP Paribas, having been part and still being part of this process has been incredibly useful, because we have learned also on the way, and we have been able to start implementing some of those policies. So I think that getting that buy-in from the industry, it's really important, And thirdly is that it was comprehensive. There was a system approach or a perspective put into it. What I mean by it is that we don't look at companies, what they can do under different sectors, then asset managers, then asset owners, then banks, Everything was within one whole strategy. And we still need to do a lot of work in even improving even more, that there's full consistency, not only within the strategy, but also, and this is the work the Commission is doing right now, is how can we ensure that in this case, the taxonomy, that the current policies, and regulations are consistent with that taxonomy. There needs to be consistent across the board. This is one thing that's really important for the financial sector, is that we like visibility, clear objectives, but also consistency across the board. So we still need to do quite a lot of work. One of the things that we keep saying is that we need clear pathways on the coal phasing out of the different countries. And we need to stop subsidizing fossil fuels. I think that those are some of the inconsistencies. Today, the energy tax regime in Europe, it's not consistent with the objectives. So I think that there needs to be, that, and a lot of the work on that needs to happen. So I hope with that, I gave you some ideas on how to move forward. Thank you.
There's a question directed to Dr. Lee. There are 3 questions. The 300 gigawatt or PV and wind power generation, is that really feasible? It was addressed in the presentation before that we have a very small territory. How is this possible? And second, the Basic Act on Green Growth is actually not an act, but actually an enforcement decree. It says that there's been a commitment to achieve 30%, but that actually not part of that enforcement decree. Well, anyway, that was a commitment in 2009, but it has been cancelled in a in-camera meeting. 710 million tons of greenhouse gases are being emitted. Now, given this Korean situation and the small territory that we have, would the renewable energy generation be possible? And the other question has to do with nuclear. What are some of the pros and cons of nuclear power generation? What are the advantages and what are the disadvantages associated with nuclear power generation? If you look at government statistics, well, just the largest scale. It's not the largest scale. The largest scale in the primary energy is oil, and as generating feedstock is coal. Now, previously, nuclear accounted for 30%, but now that's gone down to some level. So given that position of nuclear power generation in Korea, what are its benefits and disadvantages? And compared to coal, green hydrogen will become competitive by what time frame? Yes, thank you for the enlightening questions. The 300 gigawatt PV, well, this is my idea. There are houses, rooftops, and other untapped land. I think we were able to get that kind of level of power generation. We have the space. And farmland is over 17% of our national territory. And those that have to be conserved and preserved, it's about 7%. And the remaining can be used, and half of that is non-arable land. So if you do the math, the total of 1/17 that could be allocated for renewable energy generation. And also there's forest land that can contribute to the space. So the space element, it's sufficient. The other side of the coin is economic viability. You mentioned earlier in Europe the rates for wind power generation and PV, about 9.1 cents, and all of these numbers. If you crunch in the numbers, you get the total price. In Korea, it's quite high. You have the land cost, the approval process, and other administrative costs associated with this, just hiking up the overall price level. And second, the electricity cost compared to the average of OECD is a mere 60%. The traditional electricity power bill is only 60% of the countries in Europe. That is why the wind or PV, renewable energy generation, relatively seems more expensive and less economically viable compared to the current nuclear generation method. That is why, as a result, the 300 gigawatt is possible both in terms of available space and pricing. Well, as for nuclear power plants, I believe that they've done their role in the past. The issue is that spent fuel rods require a lot of labor and cost, resources to deal with them. So it is not a cheap energy source. The net unit cost of nuclear energy is about 121 higher in Japan and Europe and other countries. Ours is about 61. So Korea's nuclear generation cost is unusually low. The utility companies, the price that they sell at is not the actual cost involved in generating that. So if you look into the details of how the number is generated, it's not a cheap energy source. And you mentioned when renewable energy will become competitive. Well, I say globally on average by 30 years. In order to attain this goal, the price or cost of renewable energy has to be much cheaper. The price has to go down below 5 cents or even free. And if you make hydrogen with renewable energy, you need hydrolysis technology. The level of technology has to be heightened, and also the overall associated cost has to go down. But given the current pace of technology, I see that this would be possible, say, after 2030. The total cost involved in investing in hydro generation and the hydrogen generation efficiency with renewable energy and renewable energy costs being close to zero will make hydrogen an economically viable resource compared to the current coal and other fossil fuel sources. Thank you for that. Hope that answered your question. If you need more information, there are a lot of materials that are on our website, so please refer to them. And we look forward to future discussion areas. A question wasn't given to Mr. Dolph Gillen, so let me ask one to you.
So yes, Korea does have a very energy intensive economy and structure, so it's very difficult to achieve net zero. But as for the steel making, you talked about the outsourcing of some of the energy intensive processes. Especially you also talked about the renewable energy based hydrogen or direct reduced iron, and you said that it's technically feasible, but I think that the economics is the matter, is the problem. So so the Korea steelmaking industry, we do have a strong competitiveness because we do have a massive scales of economy with the low cost. So if we could adopt these environment-friendly solutions, do you still think that the Korean steelmaking industry can survive and remain competitive? That was my question. And also, during your presentation, you said that the energy guzzling industry, such as the cement and the steel and also the petrochemicals, you showed us the CCS, and CCS actually represented about 25%. And also in petrochemicals, you see that the CCS represent more than 50%, which is pretty high. And it's about, yes, it's related with the process. So I think carbon capture could be possible. But when it comes to storage, without any kind of carbon leakage, how can we ensure the long-term storage? And again, I think this will be led to the economic issue. So I would like to hear about your views on this. And also, you said that yes, Korea does have some disadvantages in achieving the net zero emission, especially as Korea is a divided country. You see that the election tends to be driven by political sectors, and also we do have a transmission network issue. So in Europe, the transmission pipes are linked to each other, and therefore it's pretty easy to exchange or sell and buy electricity. But in Korea, we do have a very severe limitation, especially the grid operation for transmission network. And if renewable energies are used without risking the blackout, how can we operate the grid smoothly without curtailment? So we do have very severe concerns on that. So can you also talk about this? Thank you.
Okay, that's quite a few of questions. I'll try to answer them. The first question about the economics, the economic feasibility of an energy transition in energy-intensive industries, notably in iron and steel. So I mean, you have to look at the national conditions. What is the best emission abatement option? For iron and steel, you have basically two main strategies. Either you do CO2 capture and storage, but the feasibility of that, of course, depends on the local availability of a storage reservoir. Then the other option is to use clean energy, and notably the use of hydrogen is receiving a lot of attention. The hydrogen, the green hydrogen production costs depend very much on the cost of the renewable electricity. So it makes only sense if you talk about renewable electricity cost of 2 cents or less. That is today feasible in certain countries. So there are projects in the Middle East, quite a lot of projects below 2 cents per kilowatt hour. And in Australia, you could produce renewable electricity at the same price. Now, of course, renewable electricity in Korea would be more expensive. So there's a trade-off. You can produce green hydrogen in Korea, but the cost will be high. Or you do it in Australia and you ship green hydrogen, or you process the iron ore in Australia. We think that taking that first energy-intensive step abroad is a more economically feasible strategy. And according to our calculations, around 2030, you can do it for around $70 per ton of CO2. So it's not, we're not talking hundreds of dollars of CO2. It looks economically feasible. The main value added in steel making is not in the making of iron. it's downstream in making the final steel products for the car industry, etc. So, and it is feasible to split these two steps and just outsource this energy intensive step. In terms of the what is feasible in Korea, so you really have to look at the national conditions and said, I mean, most of the numbers I presented were more global numbers, but looking at the economic structure of Korea, it's very striking how important the energy intensive industry is in a Korean context. It's in economic structure much closer to China than to Europe. And that is maybe also something you need to think about if this is the right direction for your economy.
Yes, thank you for that. I think we're almost at the end of our scheduled time. The two topics that we have prepared today have been shared by over 100 people that is joining our webinar today. We believe that this will contribute in enhancing awareness and interest in net zero emissions among the public here in Korea, and as part of an important pathway to coming up with effective ways to achieve this goal. Now, EU started ahead of us on the pathway to net zero emissions ahead of Korea, so there are a lot of lessons to be drawn from the EU precedents and example. So we believe that we could cooperate on a bilateral basis to make the pathway more comfortable and feasible. There are a lot of opportunities, but still there are a lot of challenges and tasks that await resolution. So let us join hands and exert greater effort to achieve this target. And there are also countries that lag further behind compared to Korea, and in turn, we would like to share our successful experience in the future with those countries. Now, with that, I'd like to thank the four presenters for your participation and all of those attendees that have joined us online. On the next occasion, we hope to meet you with another interesting topic so that we could put our heads together to come up with insightful solutions and ideas. Please stick with us, the New Transition Forum, and I would like to thank the EU Korea Climate Action Team for your efforts. Thank you very much, everyone.